Welcome back to World Series News, and the news is certainly ramping up yet again. We're post Anzac Day here in Australia, but that doesn't mean that the eyes aren't focused all over the world on military actions and reactions between the two superpowers of the United States and China, as it were. We're going to get into this show in great detail in a moment. Simon is back all the way from Florida. He's had a very successful run over the weekend, appearing on numerous shows around the world, and we thank him for taking the time to give us the detailed reports here. And I know that more and more people are really starting to appreciate that news as it's coming about. We're going to touch on what's happening with South Korea, and who would have thought that South Korea's got itself into a real pickle right now. We're going to look at the actions and reactions from China, the United States. We're going to cross over into Africa and see what's happening there, and of course the Middle East involved as well. And did you know that the president of Turkey has collapsed on television? Would you believe it? Last night in a debate prompting all sorts of theories that he'd been poisoned, but in fact it's supposedly a bout of gastro. There is so much tension going on right now, and who would have thought that peace through strength, or through the idea of everything old is new again and everything all at once is happening. It is confusing, and that's why Simon is here to unravel the confusion that's going on, to make you know what's really happening in the world today. Sounds confusing? Let's unravel it all right now. Simon, welcome back to the show.
Hello there, Jason. It's wonderful to be with you again. I'm most grateful for the opportunity to speak with your audience. There is indeed a great amount happening, including in the UK as well, that wasn't on your list there. So let's get into it, and you're going to run the gamut, and we'll see what we can get through in the next 60 minutes.
Well, absolutely, Simon. The really frightening thing for most people is the idea or the threat and even the talk of nuclear weapons and the moves and counter moves and the use of language. And no one's better at being able to decipher what these politicians say in their press conferences, their joint statements that match or don't match up. Let's cross to South Korea. I want to start with this headline. United States and South Korea unveil a new nuclear deterrence plan. Now, this is only one side of the story. Let's work through this and we'll continue.
So this is very, very significant, and we've talked about connections to this in the past shows with regard to the Quad, and now this burgeoning South Korea and Japan alliance, which is very much anti-China. And the Chinese are profoundly aware of this. They've reached out to each country independently, offering them to come on side with the greater Eurasian partnership, but they've gone all in with the Americans, and now the Chinese are extremely pissed off. So basically what's happened is the North Koreans, who obviously are a bit crazy, to put it mildly, have been continuing to posture and threaten with nuclear weapons, though with good cause, because they saw what happened to Saddam and Gaddafi when they gave up their weapons of mass destruction program. So they know the second they do that, they're going to get a democracy visit from the United States, and they're likely to get put on a gallows or a bayonet up the bum. So they are very much in a militaristic stance towards South Korea. South Korea has decided that they are utterly dependent upon the United States in getting a nuclear umbrella placed above them in no uncertain terms. And so the phrase that occurred today in the conclusion of the two-day meeting from the South Korean president with President Biden in Washington, D.C., is this new concept of extended deterrence. Now, they've also formed a nuclear consultation group, and President Biden, though some of the press reports have said nuclear weapons are returning back to the Korean Peninsula after a 70-year absence, because there were a lot there during the 1950s, and that he clarified in that they're not going to be on Air Force bases or stored with the Korean Army. But in order for the Republic of Korea, South Korea, to remain consistent with its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they are nuancing it in much the same way that Russia is with nuclear weapons to be stationed in Belarusia. And they're literally going to be on American Navy ships and submarines, either floating in the territorial waters or literally in the South Korean ports and harbors. So it's a very fine technicality, but they're claiming that means that the South Koreans haven't technically acquired nuclear weapons. because there's still an American captain or admiral on the ship who has kind of overall control. But they're suggesting that the decision as to whether or not they would be deployed, and it's unclear whether that's really in a first or second strike capacity at this point, that framework is going to be established through these nuclear consultation groups, NCGs, will allow the chief of the defense staff and the president of South Korea to operate on a one-to-one kind of peer basis with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the president of the United States, supposedly to make a joint decision as to whether or not a nuclear strike was actually conducted against North Korea. Now, one needs to bear in mind that the backdrop to this was the North Koreans lending, for want of another word, 500,000 artillery shells to the US government that were promptly sent to Ukraine, which filled half of their ammunition requirements for heavy artillery between now and the end of July, when hopefully the Europeans can increase production from their point of view. The Russians were furious about that and threatened to give the North Koreans hypersonic missiles. So potentially it could be a Korean warhead on a kind of 7, 8, 9 times the speed of sound missile given from the Russians to the North Koreans. Now, the Japanese government had been invited in no uncertain terms to distance themselves from the Americans, notwithstanding their mutual defense treaty, and to embrace the greater Eurasian partnership, increase their economy. And they said no. They then went to Ukraine, and they've been to America, and now they've done a deal with the South Koreans. So whether you, count it as tripling down or quadrupling down, the Japanese have given a big FU to the Chinese. So the Chinese are now saying that they also will contemplate giving advanced weaponry to the North Koreans. And bear in mind that whenever they do missile tests, they don't shoot them from north to south over the length of South Korea. They shoot them from west to east, either over or towards Japan. And that's why Japan is very anxious about military developments in North Korea. And it's a real hardening of positions. So you've got Russia and China saying we're going to go all in with super modern advanced weaponry with North Korea. And you've got America and Japan backing to the hilt South Korea. And it's a relatively small landmass. And if it all kicks off, it's literally just going to be a nuclear wasteland. It's a very, very dangerous and volatile situation.
This is the threat that everyone has been concerned about, how in fact a nuclear war could possibly eventuate. And it seems that the toing and froing and the shoring up of support has the world superpowers of the United States and China, and with Russia there in support of China, that more and more people are becoming very nervous, because it is the great flexing of muscle. It reminds me of what we talked about in our pre-production meeting of Peace Through Strength, and we'll get to that shortly. But one should be very concerned with what's happening now with the revelations of depleted uranium in Ukraine, and tying that back to our headline story today, Simon.
So in the British Parliament, one of their government ministers gave another written response, which was the same way that the initial revelation that Britain was intending on giving depleted uranium anti-tank rounds to the Ukrainian armed forces in order to use in the Challenger 2 tanks that Britain is donating to the Ukrainians. Now, this was quite shocking, because that before was kind of like theoretical, but now the relevant government minister has actually said that not that we are considering, not that we're planning, not maybe, but that it's not only being decided upon, it's been done, it's already there. The Ukrainians have full operational control over the munitions, and Britain isn't going to be asked if they should be used, where they should be used, or when they should be used. And Britain has specifically said that they don't consider themselves responsible for the extensive environmental cleanup that we've seen was necessitated in Serbia and also in Iraq from those type of munitions being used. So they've given them to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians can do with them whatever the hell they want, and it's not our long-term responsibility. Now, Putin is absolutely hopping mad about this, and he said that not only has Britain betrayed its prior commitments to contribute to the rebuilding of Ukraine, but this is a direct quote, that they're now proceeding to turn Ukraine into a radioactive landfill. And a landfill, by that he means a garbage dump, like a hole in the ground, right? So, I mean, it's a very severe escalatory step, and the Russians are very, very annoyed indeed. So, unfortunately, a lot of the stories today are not about peace and harmony. They're about, the countdown to World War III.
And this is the point of all of this, that we've got what seems to be lunatics running the asylum on both sides of the fence now, that it is the flexing of muscle. Can we stay in the UK just for a moment? And we learn now that a Conservative MP, one with a voice, has now been expelled from the Tories. What's going on there?
Yeah, so Andrew Bridgeman, who is a Tory, I think, for North Leicestershire, he had previously made some comments using parliamentary privilege, which basically protects you against slander and defamation, very much attacking vaccine safety and efficacy. And he's persisted doing that for the last couple of months. Now, in the past, from a purely temporal standpoint, he had said that it was one of the world's greatest genocides since the Holocaust. Now, by that, he wasn't necessarily meaning that it was against Jews or Jews were doing it or anything to do with Jews in any way whatsoever. He could easily have said since 1945. And he was, in fact, quoting a medical doctor who would choose to use the term since the Holocaust. It was a quote, not something that he had made up off the top of his head. He was suspended and from Parliament for about 5 days. He had the whip withdrawn from him, which meant that he was no longer technically a member of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, so he couldn't call himself a Conservative MP. And then just today, it's been announced somewhat belatedly, because supposedly the decision was taken on the 12th of April, that he has been completely expelled from the National Conservative Party. So he is now, as of the 12th of April, a independent MP. Now, he has 4 weeks from 2 weeks ago, so 2 weeks forward from today, to appeal that decision. And he can also just remain standing as an independent, or he can switch his allegiance to another party. There's a lot of talk that he's considering switching to the Reclaim Party, which is headed by the TV actor Lawrence Fox, not Reform, and not the party headed by Richard Tice or Nigel Farage or ANU or UKIP, but the Reclaim Party, which is headed by Lawrence Fox, who ironically was on a tour of some other UK city today and very much out of the news loop. So we'll see whether or not he just jumps ship or whether or not he joins another party. The real issue obviously will only come up when he has to stand for re-election, which is not potentially for another 21 months until January 2025. And the British government still has a very large working majority. So him being expelled, he was very much expendable.
There it is. It's just truly astonishing how the narrative must fit everywhere we go. It doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what you've got to say, but if you don't stick to the narrative, you will be removed. And that's how dirty politics is played around the world. Let's cross to Xi and Zelensky have finally had a chat on the phone.
Yeah, so once again, kind of semantics. Zelensky had said that he wanted a call from Xi, but it was too late. And then Xi had his 12-point peace plan with the Americans and the British shot down. This is recently, not a year ago. But it turns out that the Ukrainians reached out and said that they were willing to receive a call from Xi. Frankly, it's like they had any choice. But anyway, that was the way it was explained. Xi made the call, reiterated China's effective neutrality, though that's very much in doubt because they do have an extremely strong strategic partnership with Russia, and that's beyond question at this point. So supposedly it was quite a lengthy conversation. Zelensky expressed his gratitude. The significant events are Ukraine have agreed to appoint a new Ukrainian ambassador to China, which obviously will facilitate communication. And what's interesting in the context of how we've been talking persistently about the greater Eurasian partnership, which is this huge merger of all of the other trade and security organizations within the Russian sphere of influence and within the Chinese sphere of influence, that the title for the person that China is going to appoint is not a regular ambassador, not a high ambassador, not a special ambassador, but a special Eurasian, note exactly the same name as the Greater Eurasian Partnership, a special Eurasian representative. And that person will not only deal with Ukraine, but is going to visit all of the neighboring countries to discuss the potential for a peace plan and a ceasefire. Now, as we know, Zelensky had a law passed either September or October last year that says that it's illegal for the Ukrainian government to negotiate with the Russian government, so that law would have to be repealed. And he's also said that he won't negotiate with the Russians whilst Vladimir Putin remains as the president. So in theory, he would either have to backtrack on that or Putin would have to resign, which clearly he shows no sign of doing whatsoever. So it's kind of one step forward, potentially one step backwards. It puts them in a very difficult position if the Chinese really send a senior level delegation. It's not clear yet who they're actually going to appoint to that special position. He goes there and says, okay, we can get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire in a week, stop shooting, stop killing each other, it's all going to be good. And then Zelensky says, no, not unless they agree in advance to withdraw from Crimea, which is highly unlikely. So at some point, he may just say no so many times. The Chinese just say, we're really fed up of hearing no, and now we're going to give 500,000 soldiers and 10 million bombs to the Russians.
Yeah, right. So this is where we're fighting this constant battle with the Europeans using Ukraine. But of course, it moves further than that with China now because we had Macron over in China and Germany had another meeting over there. And now we've got the Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, having to head back to China to mend the fallout from their recent attempts to do business together.
Yeah, so Baerbock really managed to offend a whole load of people. Germany is in the process of turning off literally all of their electricity and natural gas with no backup plan. Very similar, unfortunately, to Australia. And so they're buying 90% of their solar panels and like 80% of their windmill blades from China. And if China just shuts them off, their whole green plan is like dead and buried. And all they've got is coal from South Africa. So Scholz, and it's not clear exactly what day, but during May, is going to fly to China in order to kind of like repair some of the damage that Baerbock just went like completely off the leash. And so we'll have an opportunity to cover that, when that occurs. But I think the Germans are increasingly realizing that they are transferring all of their energy dependency to the Middle East and to the Americans, and all of their renewable stuff. They've got a huge time disconnect of at least 5 years, if not 7 years. And if they suddenly get in a trade war with the Chinese, they are absolutely stuffed. And all of this talk about deploying, like the German army to Taiwan and defending the Indo-Pacific, I mean, it's not even a fantasy. It's a nightmare. They don't have the troops. They don't have the tanks. They don't have the ships. They don't have the planes. Barely anything works. They're relying upon the Americans for everything to move people from A to B. They barely lifted a finger in Afghanistan. And to think that Germany is suddenly going to militarily fight China is like completely ridiculous. and this whole concept of de-risking and cutting China off from anything that has national security implications. Yeah, like the entire European green transition plan doesn't have national security implications. So how the heck do you reconcile those two things? So it is a moment of, I guess you can call it like Schadenfreude. They're calling it Zeitenwende.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, the Munich Security Conference is now on a national tour around German cities. That was the conference that they did in, when was it, February, I believe, which had the theme of Zeitenwende, which means the watershed moment. So because they're starting to get pushback from their state governments and state premiers, same kind of situation as in Australia, that they're now putting all these government junior ministers on a roadshow to try and convince councillors and state representatives that going all in on Ukraine is in fact worth supporting.
Now, the threats that we see and explaining how Germany, how would they take on China, it's embarrassing that Biden, who pulled out of Afghanistan and left $80 billion worth of military equipment there, can go and chest beat. I'll bring this tweet back up again. Nuclear attack by North Korea, confused noises will result in the end of whatever regime that would take such an action. Joe Biden. I mean, how does he even think that he can make these statements? Or is it just plain rhetoric to just keep the average Joe thinking that America still has might? Because everything is going the other way against them.
Yeah. So he's made two specific threats. One is that if the North Koreans go nuclear, that they'll basically just extinguish them. There'll be like nothing left of North Korea. But you've got to bear in mind that that shit pile will blow into South Korea and into China.
Yeah.
So do you think China will be happy about America firing like 100 nuclear missiles into North Korea and then half of it blows into China? I mean, that's not going to go over well, right? That's going to make your kind of like, dumplings extra spicy. So they've got a problem with that. And then the general concept that they described beyond extended deterrence was they are abandoning, and this is really quite significant, it's very regressive in terms of international relations, they are abandoning peace through goodwill and any kind of negotiated settlement with North Korea. And the posture is now going to be peace through overwhelming military superiority. And that's the new phrase that they're officially using with South Korea. And I mean, that's a huge escalation step. It's very, very severe.
And we've just put some artwork there, an old book and another title, Peace Through Strength. It's going back to the old days, isn't it? Pre-Reagan, well back into the 50s and 60s.
It's going right back into Eisenhower when the solution to every problem was a nuclear tip missile.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we've brought this up, Simon, because I'd like to cross to Florida, your hometown, and mention what's going on here with Ron DeSantis. It seems that he is the deep state's darling when it comes to finding a Republican candidate whom they can stomach, and he is currently on an overseas trip, and yet Florida senators passed an election bill repealing resign to run, which effectively clears a pathway for him in his home state to run for president and remain governor. Is that right?
Yeah, so we've got three things going on now. I'll run through those very quickly. So one, he's on a bit of a world tour, and he's going to Israel, South Korea, and Japan, and one other place. I think the other place might have been the UK, trying to polish his foreign policy credentials, because obviously as an American governor, you don't generally get involved in international relations very much at all. A little bit on trade, and so he's talking about trade in much the same way that McGowan and Andrews were talking about trade with China, because technically they're not allowed to talk about international relations, but they can talk about investments and trade deals. So he's in exactly the same position as you saw with those two Australian state premiers. But he's also now in a difficult spot, because Florida has a very odd law that if you have overlapping government tenures, so let's say that you're the governor of Florida, and you're the governor of Florida for 2022 to 2026, okay? But you're interested in running as president, and you would be president from 2024 to 2028. So there's a 2-year overlap. Okay. If the tenures go back to back, so say 2020 to 2024, and then 2024 to 28, that's fine. That's no problem. Okay. But if there's a significant overlap, then you're not allowed to do that unless you resign from your first job before running for the second job. So the Republicans know that it's a bit of a long shot for him to win against Trump, to even win the Republican primary, which would be run next summer, right, in various different states, but generally kind of like May, June, July, August. And so they are literally carving out a limited one-man exception for him so that he can run for the Republican nomination as the national presidential candidate without first having to resign and step down completely as the governor of as Florida. And he's only been able to do this because the Republicans did very well in the last state elections, and so they control most of the Senate and the Florida House of Representatives. That's already been passed, as I understand it, but because he's overseas, he has to wait a few days till he comes back to sign it. But pro-Trump people have been really saying that this isn't right because it's a one-man exemption. They didn't repeal the whole law for everyone. It's just for him.
Yeah. It's very, very unusual. It's something that we learned at law school very early on, that you couldn't make laws for an individual, and yet here we are seeing something just like that. Speaking of Trump and speaking of Republicans, the Jane Carroll case has come back again. This is the woman who is going after Trump, saying that he raped her in a department store some 30 or so years ago, and is now going after him. This seems to be going on and on and on and on. What's the latest?
So she's now suggesting that she wasn't just raped by Trump, but that she was actually raped on multiple occasions by, and I'm trying to keep track of this, like 4 different people: her summer camp counselor, her dentist, another individual, and Trump. She's claiming that she had some kind of PTSD and memories kind of like went in and out. She could have reported it to the police 30 years ago, but her friends told her not to. It's a pretty extraordinary tale that she's telling, that she like met Trump in a department store. They got chatting. She was a significant media figure. He was a significant real estate developer. This is literally like almost 30 years ago. And that she asked him who he was shopping for, and he said like his wife or his girlfriend. She said, "What are you trying to find?" And he said, "Lingerie." And then he said to her, "Would you help me choose something?" Then when they went to the lingerie department, he not only asked her to pick something out, but even though what he was suggesting was something completely see-through, that he was suggesting that she, and bear in mind they weren't like boyfriend and girlfriend or anything, or in any kind of relationship, and he just met her like minutes beforehand, that she would suddenly go to a changing room and change into some sheer teddy that she would walk about with, like virtually naked. And then supposedly he was so aroused by that first of all he thrust his hand inside her and then actually penetrated her with his genitals. So and supposedly she managed to push him away, escaped with all her clothes miraculously, and didn't tell any of the security guards, didn't tell the management, didn't go to the police, didn't go to a lawyer, told 2 of her friends, but did nothing about it for 30 years. So he's not facing the prospect of prison, but she's suing him for like millions of dollars. And obviously, if she wins, then all of the media will, from henceforth onwards, describe him as a rapist.
And this just reminds me over and over again of the Supreme Court hearings when it was Brett Kavanaugh who was being attacked, and that woman who was a psychiatrist or something, a psychologist. It turned out she'd made it all up. It was just something
completely made up. She admitted like afterwards. But I mean, if he were not a Supreme Court judge, he'd be suing her for $10 million for like totally almost ruining his marriage, turning his kids against him, losing his job. I mean, that kind of false allegation is absolutely devastating to anybody. So unfortunately, we now seem to be in this quite frequently, and there's very little consequence for people making these unfounded allegations. The problem that Trump has is when he was campaigning in 2016, he was interviewed by the media outside a tour bus, and he started joking about how politicians and sports stars can really abuse women and get away with it because they're famous. And so that comment is very consistent with her allegations. And so that almost lost him the presidency. He almost had to drop out the race then. And it's making life pretty difficult for him. And that really is why DeSantis is maintaining in his run, because even though the polls are showing that he's 20% behind Trump, he knows that even if he doesn't end up, Trump doesn't end up in prison, that his reputation could be utterly destroyed by these multifarious allegations. And so he's very much just waiting to pick up the pieces if the opportunity arises.
So he's literally playing for presidential slops, as it were, if he's going to become the default backup candidate to run for the Republicans in the presidency. It's just truly unbelievable what we're watching.
Yeah.
And why would Trump, the 5D chess player, as they call him, make such an off-the-cuff remark if he wasn't referring to his opponents at that point? And of course it comes back, and Jane Carroll just comes out of the woodwork, beautifully timed in all of it. There are many, many cynics that don't believe a word that's going on in all of this. But Simon, this is why we put these reports together, to present sides of the news that most people aren't aware of. And one of those areas that I'd like to cross to now is Sudan. I'm going to bring up a headline. We're going to talk a little bit more about the latest that's happening over there.
So Sudan is just like a total mess. And frankly, the British evacuation has been too little, too late. It's a real humiliation for the British government. It is, as the headline says there, chaotic. I think British people are very shocked how many Sudanese people had come to Britain during the previous regime of al-Bashir, who's recently been sprung from prison in the chaos. And they'd come to the UK, got refugee status, got British citizenship, and then much like the Hong Kong Chinese who went to Vancouver, as soon as they had the necessary paperwork so they could come backwards and forwards as they liked, had then immediately returned to Sudan. So now it turns out that there are many, many thousands of British/Sudanese people who have the right to be evacuated. That has got people asking a lot of questions about how needy these people were in the first place and how much money and lives are being now put at risk in order to return them to the United Kingdom for a temporary period. But what has been very interesting is the Saudi Arabians have really called bingo. They've been running a ferry service on their Saudi Arabian Navy ships from Port Sudan to Jeddah, and they've been getting out like 50 different nationalities, whoever was able to get from Khartoum to Port Sudan, which is quite a long and dangerous road journey. But it's another example of a country, even though it's in close proximity, far exceeding the efforts of the Egyptians, and have really raised their status and made a lot of countries in the world extremely grateful, because they've got out like 50 or 100 of their citizens when the Germans and the Americans and the British and the French either couldn't or wouldn't.
There's some numbers we've just got up on the screen here, courtesy of Sky News. The Sudan crisis in numbers: 459 dead, 4,000 wounded. Working Khartoum health facilities, just 16%, 301 evacuated Britons. Number of British nationals in Sudan, 2 to 4,000. French evacuations, 500 people from 40 nations. Germans, 700, including 200 Germans. And crossings there to Egypt, 10,000, 20,000 into Chad. And crossings to South Sudan, 45,000 Sudanese refugees and 125,000 South Sudanese who were living across the border. Big numbers.
They are really big numbers, and the Secretary General of the United Nations was warning today that if the situation isn't brought under control, that it could become a regional conflict. So, I mean, you could potentially see the intervention of the African Union and also the direct intervention of the Egyptians, though they seem very, very reluctant to, step into the pile of dog doo-doo. There's no indication whatsoever that the Saudi Arabians want to get militarily involved, but the numbers are small in comparison to Ukraine, but obviously there's a lot of individual personal tragedy involved there. But generally, if you're a refugee, you are not wanting to be ending up in Chad or South Sudan.
Absolutely. Now, in all of what's going on, Simon, and this bulletin's been all about the threats of war, nuclear war, and the build-up on all sides and the posturing, but the business seems to be going on. We're going to cross now to India. I'm going to give you a couple of headlines. I find this fascinating in all of what's going on. It seems that they just seem to be either oblivious or a step ahead of what's going on. Check this out. Are India and Russia negotiating a free trade agreement as economic ties prosper? This has just appeared in the India Tribune.
Yeah, this is true, and I've been talking about this, and this is consistent with what they put out with the Indian foreign trade policy document last month, and they have had a working group, what is called the Intergovernmental Commission, talking about this for going back essentially a decade, but with extremely lethargic and slow progress. But there was then a 3-year gap during COVID, but now all the COVID restrictions are off and they're doing face to face. And they've literally got delegations going to India and Indian delegations going to Russia. And this is now full steam ahead in much the same way as it is with Iran. And it's all interlinked through what I've been banging on about, the international north-south transportation corridor, and also the Chennai to Vladivostok maritime route, and the north-south sea route. Sorry, not the north-south, the northern sea route, the NSR. And these are all things that we've mentioned previously on the show, but now they're right out in the open. The Indian External Affairs Minister, which is their equivalent of the Secretary of State in America or the Foreign Secretary in Britain or in Australia, they are saying, we want to do this. We want to massively increase trade with Russia. And interestingly enough, they've also had meetings between the Chinese and the Indian border commissions that had very much been put into suspended animation. Now the Chinese are very conscious that the Americans are starting to pull factories out of China and put them into India. And the light bulb seems to have finally gone off. I'm very surprised that it's taken the Chinese this long. They've been literally fighting over patches of dirt on 70-degree slopes on snow-covered mountains, as opposed to doing hundreds of billions of dollars of trade with India. I mean, that's the one thing that really looked just flat out crazy. Like, what the heck are you doing? There's nothing, not even if it was solid gold, that was worth more than having a good trade relationship with India. And so now we're seeing the Indians and the Russians in advanced steps to really cement those relationships. And the Chinese starting to say, yeah, this was a bit of a prestige issue, but we can just not talk about it for 3 months. Everyone will forget. Nobody cares. There's nothing there but mountain goats. And let's come up with a trade deal with the Indians, which is extremely logical and overdue. But, as soon as that happens, then the pressure on India to disassociate itself from the Quad and from the Americans will become astronomical. And already the Americans are having to waive secondary sanctions against them because they're just flaunting their relationship with the Russians and with the Iranians. And if they now start doing that with the Chinese, then just as I've said on previous programs, they've suddenly got strong business relationships with, 200 million Russians, 1.4 million Chinese, and 100 million plus Iranians. And they're just telling the Americans, get stuffed. And so they are important developments there. And then, of course, we've got the news out of Argentina as well.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because this will be our last story, but it's absolutely fascinating because they might know how to play football, but as a financial organisation, they are a basket case and they've been bailed out on numerous occasions by the United States. But this headline that I'm just about to put up on the screen changes everything. And if the US are looking for peace through strength, yet they are dwindling because check this out, Argentina government to pay for Chinese imports in the yuan rather than US dollars, Simon. This is massive.
It's not quite as big as the deal between Brazil and China, but it is still very, very significant Now, unbeknownst to many people, Argentina holds a very high percentage of the physical, like 10, 20, 50, and $100 banknotes that exist in the world outside of the United States. So half of them are in the European Union, a lot of them are in the Middle East, and the rest are in South America. So it's not an easy switch because a lot of people have individual savings as a hedge against the horrendous inflation that's currently running at like 105% in Argentina that we've seen before. But they are very much following in the footsteps of Lula from Brazil, now saying that in future they're going to be doing their business with China in the Chinese yuan. So that it's kind of like one to watch, but it's definitely going to have an impact upon the Spanish and the Portuguese as well. And it's interesting, of course, that Lula, after he went to China and then to the UAE, the first place that he went to was Portugal, just like I was saying, that whereas Spain and Portugal used to be the colonial masters of Brazil and Argentina, respectively, that now, because of the populations, that it's almost like a reverse situation, much the same way as we've got with the UK and India. And it's worth, if we may, just in the few minutes that I have left, to touch once again upon what's happening with the Iranians. Because
Absolutely.
we've been joking about this, saying that the Secretary General of the United Nations has even been using in the movie that got all the Oscars recently in California of everything, everywhere, all at once. And this week, the Iranians, even by their standards, have spread themselves thin. They've been in Moscow, they've been in Syria, they've been in Oman, and they've been in India, and they've been talking with the Saudi Arabians. I mean, just absolutely extraordinary simultaneous trade and diplomatic missions. And flights have been re-established, albeit at the moment they're only weekly, to two cities from Saudi Arabia to Iran. And now the Chamber of Commerce has come out exactly as I was forecasting, saying that the second the ambassadors are exchanged, which could be any day now, there's a whole load of deals in the oven, so to speak. So I think that the Europeans and the Americans are going to be profoundly shocked, because as I discussed on some other programs recently, even though the United States and Europe are now paying more attention to the détente that is occurring with the Iranians, they're still talking about that in terms of temporary de-escalations. Now, I mean, we are so far beyond that. And when you look at the local press in the Middle East, they're in no doubt about that whatsoever. This is a revolution in political affairs. And even though it's, in some diplomatic regards, only going back 10 years, in trade terms, it is potentially unprecedented. You know, we're talking about tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. And everyone is talking about the INSTC that you showed the picture of. And even the Indian foreign minister was talking about that on Monday, and how important that is. So, not trying to boast here, but your audience literally has heard me going on about that since early March, in detail, and I haven't seen that mentioned anywhere at all in the Australian or New Zealand press. It's been barely mentioned in America. Haven't seen it mentioned anywhere at all, even in the smaller publications in the European press. And it is the pivot point for the whole new reorientation of international relations. Because even now you see the Indians talking about the east of India to east of Russia maritime route, which is the Chennai to Vladivostok route.
Yes.
And they're talking about being able to bring oil and raw materials from Siberia through the Arctic ice, all the way round through the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean. And so, these are not short-term schemes. They're, 10, 20, 30-year schemes, billions of dollars, incredible amounts of natural resources. And what's interesting is whilst China are this month talking about the modernization of their society, which in many regards they've already achieved an enormous amount over the last 30 years. A comment that's being made by both the Chinese and the Europeans as this month India overtakes China in terms of population.
That's right.
They are 30 years behind China in terms of their infrastructure. And many would argue that America has not invested in infrastructure for 50 years, possibly going back to the Eisenhower administration, when many dams and transformer stations and freeways and so forth were built. And one could argue a lot in terms of Britain as well. A lot of the infrastructure is very, very old and outdated. And the problem now comes in, if you want to replace the motorway from, say, London to Bristol, unless you compulsory purchase 1 million homes, how do you build a new motorway without closing the old one first? And so this is a problem that India, with its massive population, has got. But they are extremely aware that they haven't kept up with median income. They've generated a lot of millionaires and a few billionaires, but there are still a lot of desperately poor people in India. They're starting to look at China saying, well, how come the Chinese government can do that and our government, who have been in power for a long time, aren't doing anything like that? And so the only way they can achieve that is by getting green products from China and other raw resources from Russia. And so they really, really need those two trade relationships to be functioning. It's clear that it's going to be Russia first and then India. But even today, the Indian foreign minister has been talking about how important to the future of India the Shanghai Cooperation Council is. And that is the heart of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. So, the writing is on the wall. You just have to read it. Maybe you have to translate it out of Chinese or Indian. But it is there for all to see. And it's all part of the huge shifts. It's very clear now that Japan and South Korea, they've gone all in with the Americans. And, frankly, it's a little sad to see. It's just astonishing because the opportunity that was being held out to them was very, very viable. And all they had to do, they didn't have to say, we hate the Americans, we're going to fight a war against the Americans. They just had to be a little bit more neutral. And they've rejected that opportunity. And now they're really, really going to have to live with the consequences.
So we get to the end of this story today, and it's certainly by no means the end of where we're going. It's just getting bigger and bigger. But as you can see, that the players are now becoming quite clear in who they all are and how their roles are playing out in the great restructure of the earth with the threat of nuclear war and all of it. But it seems that the US in the era of Trump, the US were the protagonist, and now under Biden, they've become the antagonist. And it seems that Biden can't help himself in trying to talk tough and not deliver, as its country seems to be losing power and strength wherever it turns. This image is really where we may well stand again in 2024 for the next big election that's coming up. Will it be Trump versus Biden?
Jason, we're going to revisit this literally monthly, if not weekly, because you are exactly correct. The nature of the United States' role in this whole game is very much changing. It's interesting now that Trump is largely distracted with all of his legal concerns, which clearly was the intention. And Robert Kennedy Jr., who we've discussed in great detail, he is banging on still about the influence of Big Pharma. He's talking about the decline of American prestige. He's talking about people losing their healthcare and their food stamps and stuff. Literally, like today, he's talking about these kind of things, but he's just not getting any traction
Yes, sir.
in the mainstream media. Literally, he's like they haven't banned him. He's still got like these accounts. He's doing interviews with very, very minor podcasts and newspapers. But the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the BBC and Australia ABC News and stuff, they are literally barely mentioning him, and they're not giving him a 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 word essay spot to discuss all the ills of America. So,
Yeah.
what's the other thing that's interesting is many people had felt that possibly Bernie Sanders, who's very much on the kind of socialist side of the Democratic Party, would come out and support RFK Jr. But today he's gone all in with the re-election of Biden. So that's quite a sad event to see, and I suspect that Kennedy may have been quite shocked by that. So it's his path to the Democrat nomination is looking very difficult. They've even announced that they're not going to have any Democrat primary debates, which is just incredible, right? I mean, that's a real affront to democracy. We've had those since the 1970s. They're literally turning back 50 years of history because obviously, RFK Jr. is a highly experienced trial attorney. And even if Biden wasn't mentally deficient, he could just take him apart from a legal point of view. And obviously, with his increasing dementia, Biden is utterly incapable of having that kind of intellectual challenge. And so they've just said he's going to stay in his basement like he did in 2020. He's going to eat ice cream, he's going to play with the dog, and he's going to stay in his basement, look around for some more classified documents, and he's not even going to do any debates, of which you'd normally have expected kind of a good 3 or 4. So that, frankly, is just incredible. When he spoke today with the president of South Korea, it was actually interesting that even the mainstream media really were quite aggressive with him. They were asking some very, very pointed questions. They pointed out that in recent polls, 70% were saying that he should just retire gracefully and let somebody else have a go for 2024, which frankly just seems a medical necessity, not only politically wise. And he was saying that he doesn't even think about his age, and that he's considered that in detail when he made his decision to announce his re-election campaign, and he's absolutely confident for fighting against Trump, who he feels that he can certainly beat a second time, even if you accept that he illegitimately won the first time. And what was interesting is that the White House press staff then issued further remarks when they were asked whether or not it was realistic for Biden. I mean, most people think that it's absurd that he's even running for re-election, but that he was going to remain in power all the way until January of 2029, like 6 years from now.
6 more years is
right?
incredible. Yeah.
Right? And they said that it would be up to him as to whether or not it served out his full second term. But people have been saying that for his first term. They've been expecting him to hand over to Kamala Harris at any second. I guess the question now is whether or not he'll continue to have her as his vice presidential candidate, because she has not been an asset to the administration in any regard whatsoever. And even her ethnic background is not proving a blessing. So I think that if he were to offer the vice presidency to RFK Jr., it would be extremely distasteful that he would have to serve under Biden in terms of the confidence and the turnout that he would ensure from the Democratic Party. That would be an extremely wise political decision. But I don't know how much he'd be able to control him in terms of his agenda against Big Pharma and investigating misdeeds that have happened over the last 3 years, let alone going all the way back to vaccine safety in 1986. But on the face of it, to every international observer, it would seem an essential step. But he's still polling well against Trump, because Trump is such a mixed basket And, we had that phrase that you had there of pick a box. That the independents just aren't sure, what other dirt's going to come out on Trump. But look at all the dirt with his family members, not least of which his son and his brother, with Biden. I mean, in any other European or Australian state, it would be inconceivable that he was contemplating running again, and everyone would be betting against him even surviving until the end of 2024 without having to resign in shame. But here it is, the entire political establishment is just rolling forward, assuming that we're going to have octogenarian A or octogenarian B.
Yeah, it's truly astonishing, isn't it? In the United States, land of the free, home of the brave. I'll put the last graphic up for the show, Simon. Yuval Harari's unipolar, dystopia versus the Great Eurasian Partnership. Two technological paradigms clash. It seems that this is where we are, the World Economic Forum or the Chinese New Era.
That was exactly what Dugan explained in his interview a few days ago, when he was saying in 2050, either we're going to have total technological control with the New World Order, which is the Yuval Noah Harari WEF unipolar dystopia. That's exactly the same thing. Or we were going to have the Greater Eurasian Partnership. So that headline that you've got there is indeed the choice that all of these countries are being presented with. And you know how I said how the Chinese and the Russians were flying around presenting exactly that choice? That was confirmed yesterday by Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister of the European Union. He gave a short speech, and halfway through it, he had a whole paragraph where he clarified in no uncertain terms that all of the third world of the globe, all of the non-aligned nations, they now have a choice between the New World Order or the Chinese model. And he said that even if they don't want to choose, they have to make a choice now. He was confirming exactly what I've been saying to you and your audience. And it was now, he's not, despite being the head diplomat, very diplomatic. But it was just in the most stark terms, and very, very few, even though it was translated from like Belgium or Luxembourgese to English, barely any media organization picked up on that. And when I saw it, I was just like, wow, that is right out there. And it was a classic George Bush, you're with us or you're against us.
And there it is. We started this show today by talking about the threat of nuclear war coming out of actions with South Korea, and we end it in exactly the same place, that it's either us or them, the new world order or the new era. Thank you, Simon, for a terrific and astonishing coverage of all the news from around the world. You don't get it anywhere else in the detail with Simon here on World Series News and the Jason Q Citizen Show, and I look forward to bringing you more news in the very near future. We'll cut through to what's happening even here in Australia in great detail with the news that is simply not getting covered anywhere else. Thanks again for watching, and see you all on the next show.